allowed in this room. If you start to bring up any points along those lines, we will ask you to leave and step up, step back. So if you're somebody who knows that you talk or share a lot and feel comfortable with public speaking, or notice that you are doing so, please share the air with someone who may have like a wonderful, incredible idea, but is not necessarily the first person to respond. So those are our expectations. And so let's talk a little bit about why we are here and what this presentation is going to be about today. So this is really going to mainly be informational. Knowledge is power, and it is also a starting point. We are in the very early days of what is going to be an incredibly difficult administration, political moment, however long it lasts. And we need to understand where we've been, where we are right now, in order to know where we're going. And so to be able to be in a space where we have a bunch of like-minded people together, to be able to share, to learn together, to strategize together, to make these connections is really what is going to help us move through this. So we really are here to learn. We have educated ourselves through this. We want to educate each other and also lean on you guys and what you guys have to offer and share with us. So a little bit of your events. We are going to do a little basic vocabulary. We're going to do break out into two small group discussions about a reproductive injustice timeline. We'll talk a little bit about legal history, look at what Trump has done so far in his incredibly chaotic, challenging 2 weeks in office, how that ties into Project 2025. We'll talk a little bit about trans bodily autonomy connected to DC autonomy and the 3DC movement, and then we will close. That was a lot for 2 hours. All right. But first, it's a good time.
All right, y'all. Like I said, I'm Angela. So we're gonna get warmed up today with a little test of our knowledge, just for funsies, and also to just get a sense of where folks are in the room, what the knowledge level is here. If you can go to complete.it and enter this game pin that's right here, or you can scan the QR.
There's nothing usual done.
It's very festive.
Yeah, I think you can, I don't know, I didn't choose it.
That's for me.
Exactly. And if for whatever reason you're having trouble with your app and whatever, you don't have a phone, whatever it is, feel free to join your neighbor and work as a team. Is anyone else not in yet? Okay. Last call. We're gonna start. Ready? Okay. All right, and some of these are going to be multiple choice and some of these are going to be true or false. So true or false, 25% of women will have an abortion before age 45. The answer is true. And just a note about language, I realized I should have gone into this before we started, but some of these questions and some of our content will be women, referring to cis women. It's important for us to recognize that it's not only women who have abortions or do reproductive health care, but for some of these like stats and data, they only encompass cis women. So just to be accurate, that's the language we'll use when that is specifically the case. Otherwise, we'll just refer to people who get pregnant or people in general. So just a note for everyone. So yeah, it looks like most folks got this right. 25% of women will have an abortion before age 45. Next question. Oh, first it's scoreboard. Steve, okay, let's go. You're in the top.
You have the best Wi-Fi access.
And also, if you've never played Kahoot before, how fast you answer also impacts your score. So you can get it right, but if you answer faster, then you'll be higher. Next question. This one's multiple choice. What year did birth control become legal for unmarried people? Your things, so I probably won't get this right. Yep, the year was 1972. Okay, most people got that right. That's great. And this is just a little taste of what we're gonna see on our timeline, but we're gonna get a more representative history. The scoreboard. Oh, Tina, and running hot. Let's go. Next question, another multiple choice. What does Plan B or emergency contraception do? Prevent ovulation, kill sperm, causes an abortion, protects from STIs.
No, I'm right in the middle, sorry, y'all. Big man is not fit to do his little ass thing.
The answer is prevent ovulation. It doesn't do any of these other things. It doesn't cause an abortion. It doesn't kill sperm. It doesn't protect from STIs. Go into a little more of the science part of this. All right, let's see. Thomas, okay. Good to see you, Thomas. Yeah, everyone's kind of, all right. Another multiple choice.
Were people who were at your party not allowed to play?
You can play, some of the questions are different.
Yeah.
How long does a vasectomy take? 10 to 30 minutes, 30 to 45 minutes, 1 hour, or 2 hours? Let's take 10 to 30 minutes, sometimes even less than 10 minutes. It's an outpatient procedure. I just think everyone should know this.
This question was tricky because I included my first answer and I was like the whole procedure, like walking in the door and leaving the door.
It doesn't include time.
Y'all being real technical.
That was my
Okay, everyone's really just.
Right.
Yeah, you know, my sixth graders, it's like the same 5 kids.
Right, yeah, exactly.
No, I think everyone's very engaged and I love to see that.
This is good.
Okay, this one you have to type your answer, so get your fingers ready. The first over-the-counter birth control pill was approved last year. What is it called? And spelling does count, I hear, but it's not that hard to see. Don't know, it's okay, we will know after this.
Right. I think I put these. I didn't even know. It's okay.
It is O-pill. O-pill is the first over-the-counter birth control pill that was approved last year. You can get it at any CVS. There's no age restriction. Yeah, all fine. All right, Maddie, let's go. On a streak with 3 correct answers in a row. Nice. All right, another multiple choice. How many states have a total abortion ban as of right now? But that is as of, I think, Roe v. Wade.
Did that include like the 6-week?
Oh, no, total abortion ban is, yeah, it does include. Yeah. All right. Maddie, holding strong, close, moving on up there. True or false? Taking birth control can negatively impact someone's fertility rate. Many studies have shown that taking birth control has no impact on your fertility rate in life. In fact, it can actually increase it a little bit depending on the method. Next question. Okay, Maddie.
Everybody's looking around.
Okay, true or false? Abortion restrictions have led to women being arrested and charged for having miscarriages. Everyone got that correct? And still up there. Okay. This is just a clipping of some headlines about folks who have been arrested or faced criminal charges from miscarriage, which is a big part of our. All right, last question, true or false? Under the current presidential administration and Congress, abortion can be restricted or banned. Got that right. We're going to talk a little bit more about what that might look like and how we can later on. Great job, everyone. Here's our podium. Let's see our top three. In third place, Thomas. Okay. And then Tina in second. And first place is Abby. Your prize is snacks. Your prize is also snacks. That's available there. Also bragging rights are on the comments.
Yes.
All right, thank you so much for playing, everyone. Hopefully that gave you a sense of your own knowledge. And hopefully you learned a few facts.
Oh, yeah.
So we're gonna go over just a few key terms. I wanted to make sure that we kind of level the playing field. I know some folks in here obviously have more knowledge. Some folks might be really new to this topic. So again, want to make sure that folks are coming in with the same basic knowledge, and that, yeah, we're just starting from correct information. So, fertilization, the joining of an egg and sperm, implantation, that's when the egg and sperm come together and attach to the surface of the uterus. Or, yeah, and begin to grow. Abortion is the termination of pregnancy, which happens after implantation. Contraception or birth control is prevention of pregnancy before implantation. Emergency contraception, what you might know it as planned parenthood or after pill, can prevent pregnancy up to 5 days after sex. There's also prescription forms like crystal acetate, also known as Ella, and copper IUD can also be used. And as we just learned, they're not the same as abortion. So the reason I wanted to go over these terms is that it may seem a little bit silly, but some of these definitions are actually really important when it comes to combating the narrative that the right wing is putting forth about reproductive health care. So this is the process that we just talked about in definition. So this is the medical science definition of contraception and abortion. Contraception is anything that takes place prior to implantation. So that can be before the egg and sperm growing, of course, or like interrupting the process of fertilization. Then after implantation, between implantation and birth is what we would define as abortion. So the anti-abortion movement, and they're also anti-contraception, typically define contraception as only anything that happens before fertilization, and they consider anything that happens from fertilization onward to be abortion. And the reason that this is problematic for us is that this really narrows the definition of contraception. And when abortion is being criminalized, that means that what we know scientifically to be contraception, such as emergency contraception, IUDs, things like that, will be falsely labeled as abortion and can be criminalized in the same way. So really wanted to show you all this just as an example of why these definitions that are rooted in science are so important for us to understand. Because when we don't understand them, the right is going to take advantage of that lack of knowledge and try to convince us that something is what it's not. First of all, any questions about this? We'll leave time at the end for like bigger picture questions and discussions, but just like for definitions, I want to give folks the opportunity. Yeah.
just for afterwards, just are slides gonna be shared at all or?
Yeah, we'll share this.
I just want to ask, is anyone uncomfortable with their picture being shared on Claudia Jones School social media? Can you just raise your hand? Just so I have an idea.
Yeah.
Do you mind speaking a little bit louder?
Sure, yeah, thank you for flagging that. All right.
Oh, and also we will have resources as well. So like often what we're talking about here, we're not like citing, okay, this isn't like English class. But we have the resources, so we'll send those out as well. So thank you for bringing that up. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Alrighty, a couple more key terms. Reproductive oppression is the control and exploitation of women, girls, and other folks through their bodies, sexuality, labor, and reproduction. This includes both biological and social by institutions and society. Reproductive justice is an organizing framework that was developed by Black women that examines intersecting areas of oppression. And this includes not only the ability to decide when to become a parent, but to decide to not become a parent, and also to raise children, any children that they do have, in a safe and healthy environment. So this is an important organizing framework that we'll be applying to our work going forward. So I also want to play a brief video that talks a little bit more about reproductive justice and why it's important as a lens.
Years, the experiences of Black women, trans people, and non-binary people have been excluded in the fight for reproductive rights. The mainstream pro-choice movement has failed to address that. There is no choice, where there is no access. By focusing on abortion rights alone, advocacy ignores the barriers marginalized folks face when trying to access things like safe abortions, contraception, and sex education. In 1994, a group of Black women coined the term reproductive justice. When they noticed there was little mention of health services like pre- and postnatal care, fibroid screenings, or STI testing in a healthcare reform, and little understanding of how things like income, housing, and the criminal justice system affect Black women's reproductive choices. They recognized that the women's rights movement, dominated and led by middle-class, wealthy white women, could not represent the needs of women of color and other marginalized people, and called for an intersectional approach to reproductive health care. The argument that abortion is an individual decision flattens the problem into a binary, pro-choice versus pro-life. Intersectionality reveals how multiple systems of oppression work together and limit access to reproductive options for Black women and other marginalized groups. Since our arrival in the United States, Black women have been targets of reproductive oppression, from being worked and bred like animals to being forcibly tested on like lab mice. Our bodies have been controlled inhumanly for centuries. In the 1900s, a new strain of racism emerged called eugenics, a pseudoscience devoted to proving white racial superiority, which led to the forced sterilization of many women of color. Between 1970 and 1980, sterilization cases rose from 200,000 to 700,000. Teaching hospitals across the South routinely performed unnecessary hysterectomies on poor Black women. In 1973, Minnie Lee and Mary Alice Grelt were just 12 and 14 years old when they were sterilized without consent under a federally funded program. As you can see, Black women's reproduction has historically been viewed as negative. To this day, Black maternal mortality rates are the highest of any racial or ethnic group in the country, with many Black women reporting being dismissed when complaining about extreme pain. The effects of these types of injustices are felt for generations. And with bans like the Hyde Amendment and the family cap directly impacting people already facing systemic barriers to care, they continue to be ignored. The current conversation is focused on the stripping of rights afforded under Roe v. Wade. But for many Black and poor people around the country, these rights have never been actualized. Black women-led reproductive justice organizations like Sister Song, Ancient Song Doula Services, Black Women's Health Imperative, and others have been fighting to keep women of color and trans and non-binary people's voices at the forefront of the movement. It's time we shift the conversation to what needs to change and address the social, political, and economic inequalities impacting a woman's ability to access reproductive health care. It's not enough for abortion to remain legal. In order to truly have reproductive justice, we need to address all the issues involved. To learn more and take action, visit liberatedbodies.org. For years, the experiences of
There we go. Okay, so as we're having this conversation, we're talking about reproductive rights, but also about bodily autonomy as a whole, and we know that reproductive rights are very interconnected with gender identity and access to gender affirming care. And so just want to also ground our continued conversation in the gender unicorn, which is a resource that's usually used for students in schools. But just to ground us in the difference between gender identity, gender expression, sex assigned at birth, and as well as sexuality and romantic attraction, and to show that these things are distinct and different. And hopefully I don't have to go too much more into this, but if folks have any questions, feel free to ask. We want this to be a space where folks are able to ask questions and be honest about their knowledge, but it's really important that everyone is grounded in the same information so that we can approach our discussion respectfully and with knowledge. Yes.
Could you just speak up a little?
A little more. Okay.
Thank you.
Well, luckily I'm about to stop speaking, so hopefully the next person can speak after.
Yeah.
Thank you. Alrighty, so, for our next activity, we're going to, read, this timeline of reproductive justice, reproductive injustice in the US. It's double-sided, so, we're gonna all take a moment to read, this timeline, and then we're gonna separate folks up into two groups. And as you read, I would like you all to consider the following questions. Number one, why is it important to know the history of reproductive oppression in the US? How can we apply the lens of reproductive justice to our work today? And how do identities like race and class impact reproductive rights?
We only have 20 copies, so share with a neighbor if you don't get one. If anyone doesn't have one to look at, raise your hand.
I can share.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
Another.
Carol?
Yeah.
Probably should have tried to use that first.
Folks, like 3 to 5 minutes to read this, and then we're gonna divide up into groups for our discussion.
Take a picture of it. Two copies, price of one.
Yeah.
You're okay.
Yes, I read about this. Wait, I think this
So it is a week.
right.
Unless there's caveats to it, it is unless you are incarcerated. And unless. It's really visible. So like you're like under conservatorship. For that reason, they can actually act. So like, yeah, but there's like caveats to it, but I can't think of the case. I know what you're talking about. Oh, good thing to bring up. Yeah, I'm making it up. Yeah.
All right, y'all, before you folks are done, okay, so we're going to go into the discussion section, our discussion, sorry. So we're gonna split folks like right down the middle of the room. So if you're like in the middle, it's choose to go to one side or another, but we're gonna try to evenly split our groups. And then within each group, we're gonna have two groups. We try to explain this. I know it's a little confusing, but so within each group, we're gonna have an inside the fishbowl group and an outside the fishbowl group. The fishbowl just means that there's gonna be one group that is actively discussing and then another group that's observing the discussion. And then the outside group is going to, take notes or think about like the broader implications of the discussion. And then we will have one representative from each outside group to report back to the full group after 15 minutes. Is anyone confused? Let me know if you are. Okay, so let's go ahead and split into our groups. We're gonna go right here. So if you're on this side, you'll be in this group, and if you're on this side, you'll be in this group. At 2:20, and let's post it early. I'll go back.
I guess there's. I'm just gonna say. Yeah. Yeah. So, the general worker, we need to take 6 people. And 6 people will actually want to transfer.
It also doesn't have to physically be an inside circle, just like as long as you're like, okay, these are the inside people and these are the outside, yeah. Because that might be different.
Okay. Yeah. That's a raise our hand. One, 2, 3, 1.
1.
2, 1.
One of them,
No, I'm confused.
They are.
Yeah, I put them up.
Are you 16?
No,
No.
it's here to concern. Usually is.
So the section has for. 15. So very good.
That's good, yeah.
Yeah, so 5 minutes. I don't get time for it.
Came from and obviously from Easter. How to fight that, only makes such a sense. They thought that before. That now.
It's important to know that. So it's important to remember like how
recently is trying to advance to having accessibility for, like, protective and working access.
But really like.
At the same time, it's also fighting to restrict for sterilization and like. It's kind of like two opposite. Like trends moving forward.
In our minds.
Which I think if you're and that there still are like new attitudes towards reproductive access. As well as shutting down access for like the rest of the movement to come forward.
Just
So yeah, pulling those two things together
is super helpful. And
We'll get to this
where's
later,
this,
but
it's just
when
like
it comes
the
to raising
injustice that
looking at the history.
since close to the beginning of the timeline, at least there were people who were in some ways speaking about it or doing what they can to like get people to say abortion stuff. And I just like to think of context like that as like similar to what the video. People have been fighting so long for design of that access or just.
I really, I think that like is really the fight back because. I mean, we've been really deprived of kind of our popular understanding. Like the history of social defense in this country through like public education. Talking about like a lot of these things that we're fighting for now, you know. Things like we were accomplished by some point by somebody. And then even before that, there were organizations and networks of people who provided, you know, reproductive care, even when it was illegal. So understanding how people did this before us, how they answered the questions that we now have to answer, I think is really important. A lot of the questions we're asking ourselves today, you know, about like gender, reproduction, sexuality, and taxes, like these are questions that have been at least discussed if not answered before. So I think that the historical basis of that is really essential because, you know, in order to move forward, we have to, we've already been, so we don't keep going back over and over again, especially as we're seeing that a lot of these things that were accomplished were not taking into account, you know, women of color, people with disabilities, you know, LGBTQ people, et cetera, et cetera.
It's too. But I think it's important because like that's the toolkit that the right will use to continue restricting things that have already been established, like you mentioned the hiring. Like I think from just signed an executive order saying to like more strictly enforce the hiring agreement. So like we have to study those what they already have in their arsenal, basically. In order to effectively what was that?
And.
Excellent. How do we apply the bands of reproductive justice to our work today?
I appreciate the timeline that touches on
Like,
changes as well.
I always hear a narrative of like, oh, we can't do abortions.
I think it's a good reminder that.
It's kind of like, it was you, I think you said it, who was like, it turns into a binary, but if you see it more as like this fluid control of reproductive rights, not just go out, not have to possible. Like understanding the history allows you to promote a more accurate narrative.
Here, and I feel like a lot of the conversations around reproductive justice.
I think when you start thinking of it, the reproductive justice we have rather than like, right, technically, legally, it makes it easier to protect
So much deeper.
reproduction rights.
We're talking about broad sterilization and how so much more serious.
Fully realize
Like, can I get
reproductive justice without having.
That's not also important by an order. So even just acknowledging that these things exist, I feel like a lot of conversations don't even acknowledge. It is that serious and that violent.
I feel like, diabetes and fat and reproductive power. Because I think that it's like those two things are so marginalized, right? And so another.
that's like an entire like population. So it's almost as if it's like they definitely, it's like an expressive, because like, see that way as well. And so it's really great that there's like more intersectional right of like activism. It's sort of just so that
I was just gonna say, as we switch now to the second half of the fishbowl with the folks who are gonna be speaking and sharing next. Something that I'm curious about from you guys is there a particular event or sort of a timeline that you didn't know about before that you would like to share about? And yeah, we touched on 2 or 3 questions, which is awesome. We can also think about responding to the how to apply the lens reproductive justice today. So I want to drop those in for part 2 of the fishbowl.
I think too, it's very clear that those just trying to go back.
Share out
Are
like
interested in population control or communities.
your back,
Increasing.
like, a little bit.
Increasing.
But we don't need like
So like, it's like that double edge of like. Still
Yeah,
wanting
thank you
to
for taking
maintain, like, zero access to reproductive health.
To answer your question about like, so most of this I didn't know, to be honest, like timelines, are not, I'm not very well spoken in timelines, but the one that stood out to me a lot was 1916. First birth control clinic opened by Margaret Sanger, and making public statements supporting eugenics in order to align with controversial demands.
Last question is, how do identities like race and class impact reproductive rights?
And it reminds me of also like suffrage movement, where like in order for a woman's suffrage, like Susan Clover, like through like, I have to pop on my right hand and then like you find minutes it's like, and so it's just another example of like progress in a way that excludes, like that was so, it's rooted in so much exclusion.
I'm also thinking.
So I thought that was so violent,
I think
like,
that
the fact that you had to rely yourself
federal
with genetics
funding.
in order to open up.
So for abortion, I'll probably,
Yeah, so that kind of plays into like.
you know, only
this
wealthier
part of it,
people can have access to
when we see this
abortion.
example,
Or
kind of repeated throughout
required
history.
to have.
there's-
I think also expanding on that, like, the wildest part of that is that movement emerged out of the abolitionist movement. Like those white women who said those things were abolitionists, they were anti-slavery activists first. And so thinking about like, how does like co-opting happen, how does like capitulation and reactionary forces happen in these movements? I think not just knowing that they're problematic, but also like, how did they get there? Why did they capitulate on these issues? And like, how do we avoid abandoning our comrades and like in struggles? I think it's really important. Because that adds that kind of, that texture and dimension to like, it wasn't just that these women, you know, were racist, it was that they actually capitulated to, you know, racist politicians, racist like advocacy groups in order to achieve these goals.
And also, I'm thinking the gradual funding in US and how that's also has impacted and how we continue to impact the world. It's also, it's.
1927. Where forces sterilization was not violent. And I realized.
The global gradual, I kind of had a little bit that we didn't have space for on the sheets, but so the global gradual, through the UK Mexican policy, which is on the timeline. It has been instituted by every Republican administration and rescinded by every Democratic administration since it was actually passed by Reagan. And it's caused a big problem for like folks around the global south because it's not just, it doesn't just prevent organizations from providing abortion, but like pretty much saying the word abortion in any of their materials. And so like, let's say there's a clinic or something that 80% of their funding comes from like local funding, but then maybe 20% of their funding is from USAID for whatever reason. Under the global gag rule, they can't like say anything regarding abortion. They can't refer for abortion. They can't say there's an abortion clinic down the road. So when it like goes back into from administration to administration, it causes a big problem for the folks on the ground who are trying to access care because of this like one US policy that goes so far. So that's also something to think about is like US imperialism and like the role that our interference continues to play in these countries.
So this sample, like in America, also reported.
No, it's foreign
Typically
countries.
for foreign aid.
So like any, yeah, countries receiving funding from USAID, any like federal international development.
It's most gonna be the global south.
Yeah, it's pretty much all ourselves, yeah.
When you said it was advocated for by the Republican Party and rescinded by the Democratic Party,
So like, so since it's put into place through the like executive branch. So if there's like a Republican president in office, since Reagan instituted it first, all the Republican presidents have instituted it, and then all the Democratic presidents have rescinded it. So it's like gone back. And Trump. And then there's also like, the last word today, and they were like, we have part of that policy, just like the class aspect, and then they kind of has like the large family planning, in addition to like funding the actual language, south and then we did and like care and child care day. They already can't like provide time for care, but then now it's harder. I would say now the care is working. Led to like a third of the tax. So it's like, it's really tough financially and also logistically to get this done is even more so. I wouldn't like raise one yet, but it could. And Title 10 is generally how like, minors or young people under 18 access contraceptive care. If they,
so much
for whatever reason, like they don't want their parents to know or whatever. A lot of places that have Title 10 clinics, they do offer
So we're gonna.
resources for people under 18. So obviously that's a huge problem.
you say.
Yeah.
So I'll into the first time administration.
It starts to slowly move our.
But they
Chairs back.
provide
To presentation mode.
There, and so then some sort of like some. What was the question?
Agree to just like, no, we're not done.
That's kind of what's going on with like abortion providers now also, like, they could, but they could risk like. Or having more, probably more likely having their funding pulled, and that can like, you know, devastate their, so I think most of them are not. But it's a good point to think about like what organizing have. Folks on the ground might have.
So what happened right now?
Let's reset,
Which is good. So these are the stuff. Just saw it for the first time. I haven't seen it.
all right, folks, we're gonna bring it back.
Yeah, but as soon as we walk that out, like.
Get settled. All right, y'all, we're gonna have our two groups report out. Maybe we'll start with our group over here. Who's reporting out? Armand, you wanna report back?
Oh, sure.
I have a lot of notes. I need to- We talked about how the fight is long and how
there's this deprived history of these social movements. And a lot of these conversations are not new, but also there's a stigma on these things. So maybe it's intentional that we don't know these things. And it almost feels like we're reverting back to pre-Roe Wade. Also this timeline, it was interesting that both you talked about policy aspects and the advancements in medicine as they are intertwined. We also talked about the focus on people of color and talking about Puerto Rico, and also how much race and class intersect. And it's almost like these things are inaccessible to half the world. On the note of intersectionality, we brought up how it's similar to the suffrage movement, where Susan B. Anthony advanced voting rights for just white women as opposed to women of color. As well as the intersectionality within disability justice and how sterilization and often talked about that. And it's good to see that talked about here. And sterilization, how it's actually more common than we think, with somebody who worked in social work talking about their client who was sterilized in 2015, and how much the identity plays into the role there. And the history of a long-term focus of white women in the center and how we need to go beyond that. Not about.
All right, who's reporting out over here?
All right, so I'm not gonna break it up into each individual question because I feel like most of the things were relevant to each other. So, we discussed a lot about how we need to understand like the context of the reproductive fight in order to develop both inclusive strategies as well as strategies that can appreciate that it's not just about access to reproductive care, but the freedom to choose whether or not to have it in the first place, right? That a lot of policies both compel people with compulsory policies in order to force procreation as well as to prevent procreation. And so in understanding like the nature of how underserved communities, predominantly communities full of racial and ethnic minorities, forgot how I started this, that because these communities are underserved, they have less access to the reproductive rights that other communities, say wealthier communities or wider communities, or communities in like first world nations may have access to. Make sure. I hope that was everything.
Thank you so much for taking the time to have this discussion. Hopefully we can continue to have these conversations, going forward, because folks are coming up with some really interesting points about like organizing, to resist some of these policies that are affecting us now. But yeah, without further ado, I'm gonna hand it over to Nico, for our next section.
Okay, so I'm gonna play social studies teacher for a bit right now. Because just like Angela was saying, about the definitions for reproductive justice and reproductive oppression, I don't think I have to tell anybody in this room that those were not definitions that founding fathers were thinking of. Just basic common sense at this point. But what actually a lot of US laws after the Revolutionary War were just basically copy and paste British common laws. And common laws, some of them were written down, some of them were more like considered basic understanding of how things should be run. And if you see in the end of the 16th century, you see one of our first, well, not really pro-choice laws, but it's actually says that if a child isn't born alive, then it's not a crime that it died, and it actually has to do with white people. So we don't have a great start in the reproductive justice history in regards to the legal aspect. Later on in the 17th century, what generally was accepted amongst the Protestants in Britain was the concept of quickening, which is when you can start to feel fetal movement. And you'll see it's 14 to 26 weeks into pregnancy, which is a pretty broad window, but medicine was better back then. But it actually, if you see 14 to 26 weeks, that's actually pretty liberal compared to a lot of anti-abortion laws that we're seeing being enacted in a lot of states across the country right now. And spiritually speaking, it was an idea that the soul was entering the fetus. I want you to keep in mind that this was a British Protestant concept because we're going to be talking about Catholic influence, later on when we talk about the history of the pro-life movement, the Catholics consider life to begin at conception, so even before implantation. And that becomes a later influence in the 20th century.
Wait, quick question.
Yes.
So for quickening was this idea that you can't have abortion after the soul enters the baby?
Yes, and that was a very regional applied law. So you see that there are federal courts throughout the US in the early American history that had different laws in three different states, different counties, different townships, but it wasn't standardized throughout the United States. It was generally considered that post quickening it would be, but that is a broad overview of again a nation of states. I want to talk about judicial review because a lot of people when they hear news about abortion, it's always in the courts, and a lot of people don't realize that because of the Marbury v. Madison case, which happened in 1803, it was a very boring business issue about contracts or something. But what the Chief Justice at the time did in his decision is he expanded the power of the judicial branch of the United States government. So if you have the executive branch, which is the president, then you've got Congress, then you've got the judiciary. Now the judiciary can define what the Constitution means, which is why you will sometimes hear justices argue about, well, we should have an evolving definition for the Constitution versus a literal definition of the Constitution, which you'll notice biblical people do the same thing. So it all kind of plays into each other. And because of this judicial review on the federal level, it really maintained a two-party system. Because if you want a judiciary that stands with the executive branch, you're going to end up with two conflicting parties. And the leaders of those parties are going to drive wedge issues to get votes. So this is kind of the whole setup in 1803, at a time where not even all white men could vote, because they weren't even fully emancipated if they didn't own land in all the states. So what has happened, especially in the 20th century, is that progressives have used the judiciary as a way to advance social causes. When there are progressive judges on the Supreme Court. Like if you remember when Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, it was a huge deal, it shifted the majority, and it was right before the election. And there isn't really an easy solution to this within liberal politics. A lot of Democrats have said expand the court, which could mitigate harm. But it's not something most party leaders take seriously on either side at this point. So these are just some cases I felt like were really important in the lead up to Roe v. Wade and the establishment of legalized abortion in the United States for a time. Griswold v. Connecticut, I really want people to look at the years when they think about this, because 1965, for reference, my mother was 6. 1971, she was 12. Like when we think of these things generationally, but my parents and other people their age are still alive and voting. And they have varying opinions on this, and we can't just look at young people when we think about this. So I'm gonna go through these since we looked at the timeline. But you'll see, I really like this headline because you see, abortion wasn't even the biggest thing that happened. So it wasn't as much of an issue as it is now, because it wasn't the wedge issue in the Republican Party, because they had already had the common law idea of quickening. The legal jargon of Roe v. Wade went by trimesters, which was very important. In the first trimesters, you were not supposed to have any restrictions on abortion based on Roe v. Wade, which was later undone, which I will talk about later, the history of the pro-life. And so this has got some of the actual language and explanation. You can see all these on the ACLU website, which is where I got these screenshots. And then also in 1973, when states had laws that were restrictive on abortion, immediately after Roe v. Wade, they were struck down. And then I just want to point out that the American people are largely pro-life. When you put this to a referendum, to a vote for the people in states, most of the time, it becomes law that abortion should be protected legally. But I do think 36% is a very high percentage of Americans who think that it should be illegal in all or most cases. And a lot of them, spoilers for the next part, but are single issue voters. My parents included, that was their one and only thing they cared about on the federal level.
Right. Light stuff. All right. Okay. So, we've heard a lot about, Project 2025, especially, during the election, last year. We started to hear a lot of, buzz about it, a lot of concern. And I just wanted to, kind of in the spirit of us doing a lot of deep history to be able to understand our current political moment, point out, and this is something that I learned in the process of making this presentation, that Project 2025 is actually the 9th edition of a series that the Heritage Foundation puts out called Mandate for Leadership, that has been going since 1981. So obviously, you know, hearing even just the name is kind of ominous, Project 2025. This is a right-wing policy blueprint that was created in 2023 by a lot of former Trump appointees and staffers, and basically kind of like laid out their policy plan that they were going to put in place as when Trump was elected to office. So I put check marks next to the things that have already happened in the 2 weeks of Trump's first administration, and then these are things that are in Project 2025 that have not yet been enacted, but we should be prepared for, and we should be ready to mobilize around and think about. So ending Biden's Gender Policy Council. Hey, this is why that timeline is so important. Remember that Mexico City policy that Reagan implemented? So Trump brought it back during his first administration, and he is bringing it back again. I want to highlight this kind of absurd phrasing of the global abortion industry. The Mexico City policy is intended to end any international aid to NGOs that do any kind of reproductive health work and healthcare, and that goes way beyond just abortions. So the next thing that is kind of on this like policy agenda is requiring so it's risk evaluation. It's REMS, it's risk evaluation and mitigation strategies, I believe. I should have included that in the
Evaluation and mitigation strategy.
there, boom, whoa, fuck, got it. So as a stepping stone to eventually banning mifepristone and mifepristone, they want to end telehealth prescriptions for mifepristone and mifepristone. Thank you.
Yeah.
So
So mifepristone and misoprostol are drugs that are used for what we would call medication abortion. So that's abortions that uses pills and can be done outside of a healthcare setting. And they're used in conjunction. You can use just misoprostol, but they're usually used in conjunction. So obviously a very important tool for abortion.
thank you, Sketch. I just wanted to make sure I got that definition absolutely right. So right now, this can be prescribed in telehealth. It can be described by a provider. I think double check me around, like outside, like one state to another.
It's getting weird already.
It's
but
getting weird
yeah,
already.
Technically,
That is possible right now, but it's a big gray area. So Project 2025 calls for first making this, you can only get a prescription for this in person from a doctor, and then that is a stepping stone to eventually reversing the approval for it entirely. There's also a lot of discussion that kind of ties into the RFK of it all and vaccines, but like any like stem cells and the like phrasing and like the fuck ass science that they like talk about in Project 2025 is that it's coming from aborted fetal tissue. Like it's just it's like literally like nonsense. Like somehow like they're also going to like be calling into question vaccine mandates, like are also tying into like abortion rights, reproductive rights in this Project 2025 timeline. And then kind of going along with like the diet. Sorry.
I guess my question is, would this impact like in vitro fertilization and like those kind of like family planning stuff?
That is an excellent question. Answer exactly yes. I did not look through that when I was looking at Project 2025, but thank you for bringing that up because that definitely will impact.
A lot of them want to create exceptions for it, but based on a lot of the jargon, they've already pushed forward with this.
Gotcha.
Like they're kind of shooting themselves in the foot there.
Yeah, and then kind of going along with the whole like literally like trying to change people's understanding and definitions of like contraception versus abortion. They are also, the plan is to fund like junk science research from CDC and HHS. To create research and its policy agendas, exploring the quote unquote harms both mental and physical that abortion has brought on women and girls. Yes.
Yeah, what's REMS?
Risk evaluation and management strategy.
Mitigation.
It's mitigation,
Right.
yeah.
And then,
Mitigation strategy, which is like basically like, oh, like this needs additional like doctor like oversight, clearance in order. And it was taken away in 2016,
Mhm.
but it's basically a policy thing to make it harder to get two-step chemical abortion
Gotcha.
by pill.
And then when they say like back, what are they referencing when they say, oh, like we're using dead fetuses to develop vaccines? Is there any truth to that?
That's
at
what I
all?
wanted to, I could have my hand with it, like,
Oh,
just the science of like, what is a stem cell? A stem cell is just our bodies that have cells. Like cells do different things based on the kind of cell it is. A stem cell, which you usually think of embryonic cells, because the most common ones come from embryos, because those are the most versatile, right? An embryo turns into your body, and those cells transform into like a ton of different stuff.
I can actually.
But your body has them too, your
I-
bone marrow has
Yeah.
them. like-
I can explain it because, basically in stem cell research, sometimes they use adult stem cells, which are pro-life movement is totally okay with. But fetal stem cells, which are generally cloned from like literally one just to start an embryo, that usually never even reached implantation. It is to a lot of very radical pro-life people, that is an abortion in their mind, that is the killing of a life, which is what they say on paper, so they're against fetal stem cell research. But a lot of less radical pro-life people, a lot of times Protestant pro-life people, don't care as much about IVF, which IVF is actually even more death involved for pro-life people because you freeze embryos and a lot of them are just discarded. Like you actually freeze dozens of embryos, a lot of times they implant 4 and then either they miscarry because it's still a complex medical procedure, or they'll end up reporting USM very early on. Because it's unlikely that just implanting one, which is a very expensive medical procedure, will definitely.
Thank you guys so much for clarifying and asking questions. It's helpful.
So yeah, it's just a scientific definition.
Yeah.
Like, you can turn adult stem cells into embryonic stem cells because that doesn't mean it comes from an embryo. It's a definition for the way that it can grow into different kinds of cells.
Yeah,
Just
the
a
science
definition.
is constantly evolving, but they're still trying to use it in their own discourses and gaining traction. Yes.
Thank you guys so much. Then the last couple of things I'll mention that were in the Project 25 blueprint is reducing, AKA ending, DOJ prosecution of the FACE Act, which is Free Access to Clinic Entrances Act. So 23 protesters so far who were like convicted through this act that passed in '94 to ban, protesters basically from like blocking the entrances to abortions have been pardoned by Trump for his first week in office. And, again, another little timeline throwback, reintroducing the Comstock Act, which would ban abortion medications, equipment, materials from being sent to the US Postal Service. Which, again, creates another barrier to people in, states where abortion has, basically been banned from being able to access contraception and abortion. And then there's a lot of very specific measures and points within points that add to an increasing level of abortion surveillance. This includes reintroducing the quote unquote ensuring accurate and complete abortion data reporting act, as well as surveillance of medical schools and hospitals. So that's just a little overview of Trump's policy plan, what's been enacted so far, what we can anticipate coming in. All right. Fucking hey. I was like, I deep fried a picture of them with like Instagram folders because I was like, I need a visual, but it needs to be disrespectful. And so he said,
he looks like though.
that is what he looks like, that's true. So yeah, it's not like that's hard, it's not hard anyway. But like he said, his quote from his hearings, which are ongoing, confirmation hearings, With mifepristone, President Trump has not chosen a policy and I will implement this policy. So interpret that as you will. That is his direct quote on the subject from confirmation here this week. And I just had to include this photo. Yes. Support me, please. Support me. All right.
Awesome. All right, so hey everyone, I'm Ryan again. And a lot of my stuff has already been talked about. I'm gonna be honest, I was really excited about what came up in the breakout discussions. It did not take y'all long to like get into like the real meat and potatoes of like what we're talking about. We're talking about communities that are underrepresented. We're talking about communities that we do not have statistics on. We cannot accurately talk about these communities because we don't even know that they exist if you're looking at the statistics that are usually used to talk about things like bodily autonomy rights and anything related to reproductive rights, right? So the first thing that we wanted to talk about was I wanted to talk about was Black maternal mortality. And the reason why is because the least of us does represent all of us, right? Like the things that happen to the least of us will in fact happen to all of us. And so we see a lot of white women freaking out about what's been overturned, but we know if you look at history, it's already happened to Black women, it's already happened to immigrant women, it's already happened to transgender and non-binary folk. It's been happening, right? And specifically disabled people. So that's a little bit what we'll talk about. But I'll skip some of the things that we already know, but I want to mention that these are preventable deaths, right? So these are some quick facts that I just put up there. These are not just things that are happening, right? We're not using passive voice to talk about people's lives that have literally been taken. And the ability to have further life has also been taken, right? And so that's really important, this passive language. We also see it being used to describe the mortality rate that is happening in Palestine, right? We see that they talk about these bodies as if they're just dying and nothing is happening to them, right? Nobody is causing it. But we do know that there's a cause, and so we need to recognize that. And so what that comes from is, like we mentioned earlier, and like a lot of y'all talked about, eugenics, and the idea of eugenics started here. It did not start in Nazi Germany. Hitler was not the creator of that, wasn't really the creator of anything besides genocide, right? In that specific scenario. But that idea and where that theory came from was actually built right here on US soil, which was already stolen by from indigenous people. And so even more so talking about that, also doctors were paid to sterilize people, right? They were literally incentivized. So we're talking about a systemic issue where we mentioned like some policies and things like that, and things that were like common law, like what was the term? Oh, quickening, thank you. I was gonna say picketing, but that's not. Right, yeah, I know, it has a little more zing to it. They were white though, so here's but yeah, so we know that those things were happening at a systemic level, but they were also happening very systematically, right? So if you give someone that already doesn't believe that certain people should even be alive, let alone have bodily autonomy or rights, obviously, if you give them a financial incentive in the world of capitalism, they will indeed take that. And that actually ended up influencing the next multiple generations of doctors and how we looked at the biology of people, how doctors, like, I think it's on the timeline. I always forget oh wait, I have it here. Yeah, James Marion Sims, I always say it wrong. Whatever, he was a prolific doctor, right? He did all these things, but he did it at the expense of a lot of Black women's bodies, right? He did it without anesthesia, and a lot of the things he discovered could have definitely been discovered in different ways, right? It did not have to go about that way. However, you often don't hear that part of the histories talked about, right? So another thing is that also talking about, so we mentioned Margaret Sanger, that also came up, right? Founder of Planned Parenthood, but yeah, had weird eugenicist ties. And if you look at like a lot of the articles and like things that were written about her, you know, she was like, well, I'm going to do this because it's going to help like our end goal, right? We're still going to get bodily autonomy and reproductive rights for like the women, right? And whoever she really meant, right? Which is really just wealthy white women. So if you look at other figures like Helen Keller, a lot of people do not know, she was a famous eugenicist. And if you do not know who I'm talking about, she was a deaf and blind woman that was very wealthy. So that part is always like left out, right? The only reason she got the education she got was because she was very white and very wealthy. And so she was a famous eugenicist, right? Like literally going against what you would think was her own identity, but she did not identify with people who were not rich and white women, right? So that's something to keep in mind. And then also getting into, like I said, Indigenous and immigrant women are famously underrepresented in available statistics. So I just kind of wanted to show. So this is an interactive map. And like we said, we'll send out the resources after. But this is a very common map that you will see that's used to talk about the policies and access after Roe was overturned, right? However, as we know, there are reservations that are not included in this. We do not even know the statistics on those women because they are never been represented. Like I'm like digging to find some information, and what oftentimes you'll come by is you will see the MMIW movement, which is the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women movement, which is basically saying like there's a whole lot of women that are missing. We do not know what happened to them. We don't know where their bodies are. All we know is that they are no longer a part of our community, and we would like to know, right? We would like to raise awareness to that. And so what this kind of shows is that as much as we can look at like the state boundaries and like what that means for people who have the rights to travel among states and maybe get, care in another state or go to a sanctuary state or go to a city that has like shield laws in place, which we'll kind of get into as well. But basically that means like doctors can help you with whatever reproductive rights or whatever reproductive issue that you need help with in another state. And the state actually has laws that will protect them in case another state, like a southern state or somewhere that has more restrictive laws, tries to come after that doctor or the people involved. And we see some of those cases as well right now. And so then also talking a little bit about like the ICE detention centers, right? So that's another part or another sector of our communities that are woefully dismissed. We do not know how many forced sterilizations have happened in these spaces, what kind of reproductive care they are or are not getting, right? And typically it's what they're not getting. And so it's just important to remember that when we're talking about statistics, we can only talk so far before we have to be very honest about the fact that we do not actually know. And until we're listening to these communities and bringing their struggles and their actual stories to the forefront, we'll never know, right? And that's why there's a strong oral tradition within Black and Brown communities, right? Because we know that our stories will not be accurately told if we leave it up to interactive maps like this. So we'll start there. So there's a lot, but I skipped over some stuff because like I said, y'all kind of talked about it, but we'll see about recycling. So what now, right? So we talked about Roe v. Wade. And I do want just like a quick discussion happen between like maybe 2 to 3 people like around you. You don't have to like make a big group or anything. But when we're talking about like the South, where more than half of the US Black population and the largest population of LGBTQ identifying people are, this is where, as you can see, as you can see, some of the most restrictive bans, right? So meaning that bodily autonomy and reproductive rights are going to be really tough to come by. And not only that, but they're going to actually be seeking out to make sure that if these people are going out of state to get any services, they are actually like following them to see like what their patterns are. Are they getting anything mailed to them, right? That could possibly be something from other states that is available regarding reproductive rights. Okay. Also, Black and Brown women are overrepresented in for Medicaid beneficiaries, right? This is actually one of the most direct ways in which Black and Brown communities, immigrant communities, Indigenous communities are going to be impacted because they, if Medicaid, if the federal ban does in fact happen in the ways that we, foresee it to happen, that will be the first way that states are allowed to kick people or to not allow people to use that funding for their reproductive care, right? And so we've already seen it happen in states that are very restricted, where basically there's options for families, like if, so say for instance, somebody does actually want to go to term with their pregnancy, right? They do actually have Medicaid options that you are able to transfer over to a small family Medicare or Medicaid account. However, oftentimes they don't publicize that because they don't want to fund it past that point, right? Because they don't care about the baby after it comes out of the womb. They really don't care when it's in the womb, but they pretend to. And then when it comes out of the womb, they kick them off. And this happens all over the South and pretty much everywhere, but there's more education in some of the more liberal states, but it still happens on a grand scale. So with that, I want to, open up a little discussion just about what does an abortion ban look like for Black, Indigenous, and immigrant women and transgender non-conforming folk that are underinsured in a restrictive state, okay, and in a restrictive state. So again, this only has to be like 2 to 3 minutes, just kind of getting your ideas ruminating. I know we kind of covered it a little bit, but it's really important to hear from those folks that maybe haven't been a part of this conversation and just thinking about what we can do, but we'll get there, but thinking about those ideas. So go ahead, just get with like 2 or 3 people around you. We'll set a timer for about 3 minutes just to let y'all kind of get some ideas out there and then we'll come back. Oh, yeah, so it's, oh, I'm sorry, yeah, I got on my iPad, yeah, it's right here.
Question. Are these slides, can you upload it anywhere? Just because I'm struggling to keep up. With all this.
Yeah, we're gonna share with resources as well.
All right, yeah, yeah.
Who wants to start?
What was it?
A lot of.
I would really like to.
So even if you are like there to get hurt, you might have to work.
And I think the worst word is.
So it's like either staff that.
Here's like.
So you're saying like lack of access to abortion for people who are on like public. Programs, whether, like, forcibly black people are, like, literally-
Other friends that like traveling, getting other countries. No.
Yeah.
So those.
I mean, it's the. Despite in. Despite in.
I love it.
You're kind of like, yeah, I mean, we saw like what was happening. But. Category. Texas to. Or Georgia to. But it turns out
Like getting people access to the, what was it, the collective bargaining?
Well, that's what you talk about more about. Cover like the general. I mean, there should be like. Like, you know, what is the fight back on? The total bang breakdown. All your benefits are generally negotiated with your employer. Many times, your right to an abortion would be covered by.
Would be covered by later community.
When that's been negotiated with your employer. So to the extent that some of the people that fall into that category are union members that have an collective bargaining agreement. They have a state protection. However, let's not forget that, you know, in a whole other subject, this administration wants to undermine the rights of union members.
Yeah,
I know I was taking that little horror field.
no, but I like that.
Thank you, that was a great way to end the conversation. I hope that you would like to revisit this conversation. Because there's a lot here, right? And we know that to be true, which is why flattening this idea, flattening reproductive rights into just, you know, like one law was just not the way that it works. And you all saw like the short video. I actually think some of y'all came in a little late, but the video was very helpful because it was just talking about that idea that you cannot just think of it as like one law that's passed or one thing that's banned, right? Because we know that everything is interconnected, and people that live intersectional lives every day, which is most of us, not all of us, but most of us, we do recognize that there's a lot of ways that our rights are already limited. And that's actually why I included this like kind of abstract photo, which is from The Handmaid's Tale, the book, but you may have seen the adapted version, that's a series. And the reason why I think it's really important to recognize is because oftentimes when this show is talked about, and there's a lot of critiques online about it, it talks about it, looking at it in a vacuum from like what our future looks like, right? But most of the things that happen on that show, if not all, have already happened to people in this country. And this is not just a US issue, this happens many other places, but what we can affect change on, especially being in DC, which we'll get into, like what we can actually tangibly do, is really important. So the last thing that I do want to mention, and it is part of the bigger conversation, is the community care portion, that is really, really important, and we'll talk about that a little bit at the end. But Black midwives and doulas have historically taken care of the communities that they are part of, as well as taking care of the white communities that they had to serve, whether it was during enslavement, post-enslavement, right? Oftentimes they were the caretakers of everyone's children. And there were states that actually outlawed Black midwives or the practicing of midwifery. And so we see like the surge of Black midwives over the past like 20 to 30 years. However, it's still very niche. And so we do need to recognize that that's who we need to be supporting when we're talking about bodily autonomy. It also is the right for whoever does decide to, in fact, maybe carry a pregnancy to term, or whatever that case may be, that they do have the community support that they deserve. So I'll just pause there for now, and then I'll pass it off to Nico again.
Okay, so we're about to go into my bread and butter. Oh,
Oh, it's okay. Let's go. No, we'll go back to it.
so this is me, in all these pictures. This is my bread and butter. I was raised in a single issue pro-life household. And listen, I'm gonna send out, make sure you send in your email, because I'm gonna send out a master doc of like, just like lots of resources, articles. I could spend 4 or 5 hours finding articles on NPR from people who grew up like me, or I can just tell you my own experience and how I've contextualized it since then. But here's a basic outline of the history of the pro-life movement in the United States. Like we talked about, there was a concept of quickening. American Protestants weren't that concerned with abortion. If you think about the 1960s, you're not thinking about a fight for reproductive justice, you're thinking about civil rights. And the Republicans and Democrats at the time were very split on the issue of advancing the issue of Black liberation in this country. And after the civil rights movement, being overtly racist started to become politically unfavorable just because of an aesthetic, to be quite honest. And so the Republicans needed a new wedge issue. And the only people at this time in this nation who are really focused on the morals of abortion were Catholics. And if you're not too familiar with inter-Christian discourses in white America, Christian is like one circle and a Catholic is a circle within that. So it's a specific denomination of Christianity, but especially amongst white evangelicals in the South, they actually don't consider Catholics Christian because we're a little too ritualistic. And so the Republican Party adapted to this issue to make it an issue that they would have total party uniformity on. And so here's like a very basic outline. So it becomes a Catholic to a Christian movement in the post-civil rights after Roe v. Wade is passed. You see that there's the racism at the core of this, and one of it goes back to the legality actually. Because a lot of the grassroots movement, I didn't actually even know this until I started researching it. A lot of the grassroots movement for Roe v. Wade, for abortion rights amongst like activists on the ground, were actually concerned with the way that Black midwives, Black doctors were being penalized legally. And so it was a way to advance that right under the heading of abortion. And when you look at what they're doing now, you can easily see how we can change legal terms. You can go back to restricting that Black doctors and medicine. A lot of, at different points in history, American history, there have been Black medical schools, HBCUs that specifically trained Black doctors and midwives. And then the US shut them down because they weren't accredited. So they're trying to go back to that. And actually recently, just a couple of days ago, RFK Jr. claims that Black children need lower vaccine antigen dosages. And that's terrible. So that's the kind of fear we're up against. That's the kind of threat we're up against, trying to vaccinate Black children with different vaccines. A quick thing I want to note is that with the rise of Reagan, everything got worse. They call it the Burger Court, which was a conservative court majority that happened because in the post-Reagan era that rescinded a lot of things. One of the main cases that started to rescind abortion for 1992 case Planned Parenthood in DC, and it created an undue burden clause, which said that you can restrict abortion at any point in a pregnancy, as long as it doesn't cause an undue burden. And if you think that's not really vague, that is on purpose. So I want to really point out that amongst the pro-life coalition, there's a lot of moving parts. The majority of the pro-life movement nowadays is made up of extremely racist white Christians. But in pockets of that, a lot of issues are used and misconstrued in order to make people sympathetic to an anti-choice cause. For me personally, a big issue for this was the disability issues, because if you saw in those pictures, my youngest brother has Down syndrome. And if this were 11 years ago, I'd be giving you a speech about how he's like persecuted because he could have been aborted. So they use issues like that to gain sympathies, especially with parents. Same with the Margaret Sanger history. When I met pro-choice liberals in college, I was shocked they didn't know about the Margaret Sanger stuff, because I knew Margaret Sanger was a eugenicist when I was 7. So just being aware that it's very important to know that history, to contextualize it for people who are confused or think that, well, maybe abortion is being used to specifically target people. And it's like, it can be anything with reproductive rights being targeted to try to form populations. It's about individual liberty and autonomy. So now I'm going to go into trans healthcare. If you couldn't tell, I'm transgender. So trans healthcare, if you think that you can use legal clauses to create issues later on with abortion care in and of itself, becomes even more complex when it comes to trans healthcare, because there is so much more recent prejudice that is built into this nation against trans people. So this is just pictures of me, my other side as a child. I want to give you guys some quick trans rights talking points and facts that I've noticed a lot of allies kind of have lacking knowledge in. I'm not saying y'all are lacking in knowledge, but it's a teaching, and I just want to give some basic rundowns. So one of the biggest issues for trans rights in the US and abroad are TERFs. That's the Queen of the Turks. I'm here, J.K. Rowling, author of Harry Potter. If you know anything about international feminist movements, Britain has a much more solidified TERF coalition. They're much more anti and explicitly anti-trans over there, which we're getting there now. We'll get to the executive order that was just passed yesterday by Donald Trump. But these TERFs, I find, especially try to prey on traumatized women and fearmonger in order to get them to adopt radical feminist policies that at the end of the day rescind their own rights and their own bodily autonomy by especially stoking fears of trans women. Personally, as a trans person, trans man myself, and being in trans spaces, it's very easy to see when cis women are comfortable with me and not trans women. And when you look at even the language of the executive order, which I will in a second, all the examples, all the like specific policy outlines majority are about trans women specifically. Trans men tend to be more of an afterthought. Lots of feminist scholars have written about this. Most people think like the dominant culture thinks, well, first a woman wants to be a man, she wants to be free. So when we're thinking about TERFs, you have to acknowledge that it's they have their own alt-right pipeline for liberal women who don't have answers for why their life is the way it is, because liberal feminism is so shallow. Trans women in sports is kind of how they got this in the mainstream discussion in the last few years. It's not an issue. If anything, the issue is that college sports are a way for rich kids to play lacrosse and then go to Yale. I'm sorry, like women's track is not the inequality in sports that look at the WNBA incomes. Like, I simply cannot take this seriously. There's like one trans athlete that's on every headline. And actually there have been standards for trans people in the Olympics from the 80s. You can look it up yourself while we still have free access to Google. And then the final thing, which I feel is one of the most easiest wedge issues, is minors transitioning, because a lot of people feel like, well, how can a child know? And then also there are a lot of transitioners they send on the road to talk about how their life has been ruined. They always choose the ones who look like they can pass as cis again. This is one of them. Her name's Chloe. She goes to every Congress hearing and she's funded by like the Heritage Foundation and a million other anti-choice, anti-trans, anti-liberty people who pay for her hotels. And the thing with minors transitioning is that this has been standardized science. This was standardized before gay marriage was even legalized throughout the entire United States, even before like the first state legalized it in other countries, they had standardized how to approach children who are dealing with gender dysphoria. I do think it can become a more complex issue as there's more acceptance and how to, you know, really give people the proper mental health care they need to make a decision at a young age. But at the end of the day, children should have bodily autonomy. And when you're looking at ages where children are starting to actually go into hormone replacement therapy, so not just puberty blockers, which weren't even invented for trans kids. Puberty blockers were invented for children who are dealing with early puberty, because there are conditions where you go through puberty as young as 4 years old. And so they were creating solutions for that. Then it broadened to children who were dealing with gender dysphoria and were reaching the age where puberty was going to start, so like 10, 11. Most trans minors don't go on HRT until they're at least 15 or 16. There's been a handful of like trans teenagers who get top surgery and other such surgical interventions, but it tends to be 17, 16, and children who have been showing signs of gender dysphoria since they were in preschool and consistently. So this has been standardized by the Pediatric Association for years. And what conservatives have done is fearmonger about it and actually make it much harder for children to get the health care they need in an honest way. And if we're being really super honest about it, a lot of trans healthcare and the research around it is fundamentally off, because in order to access healthcare as a trans person, myself included, you sometimes have to tweak some of your history when they're doing interviews. Or when I got top surgery, I paid for it out of pocket, but my surgeon, because it's a fearmongering about transitioners, he wanted an insurance, he wanted a letter from a therapist, and I had to pay out of pocket as a 22-year-old in DC at a place that does informed consent. I had to pay about $600 out of pocket to see a therapist who wanted to talk to me more because of the trauma I had as a child. So I ended up having to pay more, and that was as an adult. So when I hear these fear-mongering stories about, oh, this 11-year-old just walked into a clinic and got testosterone, I'm like, that's just blatantly false. So don't fall for it. So this is yesterday's executive order. It's called Defending Women from Gender Ideology, Extremism, and Restoring Biological Truth to the Federal Government, which is a long way of saying we now have state enforced sex binary and no gender identity in a legal setting. This was not something that we're reverting back to. This is new language that they're assigning to it, and actually directly impacts abortion, because some of the language, when they define man as a male, it defines it chromosomally, which could have implications for when the sperm meets the egg, and certainly it's contraception, because now you're using chromosomal definitions and not just genitalia, which is what they had previously been using all the discourses. It's very scary because there were explicit outlines about trans women in prisons being sent to men's prisons. And this is, I want to highlight that this is an issue that is kind of in the underbelly of discourses, because we're talking about incarcerated people, but there are so many abuses in the prison system that are standardized in regards to trans women, including putting them as cellmates with violent offenders to placate those offenders so that the guards don't have to come. So, and especially like thinking about using gendered violence to make someone's job easier is not something that should happen in the country. I don't think I have to say that. Looking forward, we have hope. Italians are having a moment. I'm not sure when I attended the Yamapata Spigarelli family reunions, I did not see a lot of revolutionary potential, but hope is the last thing ever lost.
Oh my God. Okay. So, this is kind of our last like content thing. But, in all of these discussions, want to highlight the DC autonomy movement. For those of you who are not familiar, DC has had home rule since 1973. That was an act of Congress. That act of Congress can be taken away. Trump has alluded to suspending home rule during his campaign in this kind of like shock doctrine style, like thing of federal rulings that's been happening over the course of the 2 weeks. We've not seen any action on home rule yet. But obviously this will impact abortion access within DC. DC is some people come from around the region and beyond in order to access abortions and reproductive care here. And so even if home rule is not suspended, because I mean, there has been some debate, you know, like, is it worth its energy? Like, are they still gonna do it? Like, abortion is still under threat, whether or not this goes through. And again, this is such an active, like, ongoing thing. Like, we're really like pulling from executive orders that came out like yesterday. That's something to keep in mind. Encourage y'all to get involved with something like the Free DC movement, Defend DC, if you are a DC resident.
Oh,
No,
now it is.
Cool.
What the F do we do now? So just something to kind of point out, and we did discuss this a little bit, but unwanted or unplanned pregnancies become solely the responsibility of the poor working class, right? Or to figure out how they are actually going to survive within communities that are already impoverished, are already underserved, do not have health insurance that is woefully needed, especially in the early years of the child's development. We're talking language acquisition, so many things that they are not having access to, right? And so that feeds into like the public school system, which we know is really ridiculously underfunded. And so there's just a myriad of issues that happens after the child actually does become born, right? And so what that means is that they are now dependent on the state in a perpetual state of low paid labor while responsible for repopulating the working class, right? So creating a low a poor working class that is dependent on the state and also only able to get the jobs that are accessible through their y'all know what I'm talking just a cycle, okay? Like, if you're poor, your kids are probably gonna be poor, and the state wants to keep it that way. Like, let's just like stop there. And then also the birthing population that does try and seek out abortion or reproductive care are criminalized, like we just mentioned, subject to mass incarceration, and their labor is therefore even further extracted, right? And we see that with in California recently with fires, right? There's a lot of incarcerated individuals that lose their lives, right? And that are not well reported at all, but they lose their lives fighting these fires. And that is a huge issue. And if they even live to get out of prison or whatever the system that they are in, juvenile detention centers, etc., they are not offered these jobs, right? These are not transferable skills that they can actually use once they leave, if they are able to break out of the mass incarceration system and recidivism rates. So basically, as I mentioned, we need to put emphasis back on community care because it has shown, and again, we'll send out resources, but it has shown to lower these maternal death rates, as well as just supporting the community be able to strive, right? And so something kind of tying into what we were talking about as far as DC autonomy. So DC Medicaid members have access to pregnancy and postpartum care through just one of 17 programs, but this one is specifically called Momoto Village. And it's the Mother's Rising Home Visiting Program. So this, like I said, it's for during the pregnancy, but also after, and any type of care that you can imagine, whether that be literally just access to like groceries, access to diapers, access to different types of foods, or whatever it is that the person that's pregnant and the child needs at any given moment. And this only happens because DC has home rule, right? Like these programs are only able to thrive because DC has home rule, which is something that we talk about a lot. And so this also can only be possible if healthcare benefits are maintained and expanded, which is again, one of the first things that will be attacked. So we need to make sure that we are protecting that, which is doing that by pushing for single payer healthcare, but also for DC to maintain its autonomy / home rule. Like Hannah just wonderfully mentioned, hands off DC, free DC, there are movements that are happening that really need not only y'all, but everyone in your community. Because it doesn't mean anything to have like a Twitter back and forth, if you don't know your neighbors, if you don't know your community, if you can't actually affect that change to make sure that they are not repealing things that we have already fought for in the past. So with that, I will stop talking. So thank you so much for coming out today. It's been hot, but it's been real. This was great. We have a few minutes for questions. And then we'll just officially wrap up. So is there anything burning that y'all have been keeping on your notes or keeping in your brain that you'd like to know? Yeah.
I'm just curious about any like DC organizations that are already doing reproductive justice work that we can support, or like whether that's just like manpower or, you know, promoting their resources. Yeah.
Maddie, do you wanna, not to call you out, but do you wanna talk about your work?
Yeah, so I am one of the co-founders of DC for DC, or emergency contraception for DC. So we provide free emergency contraception in DC, as the name would suggest, and work to destigmatize it. So yeah, we provide through like distribution sites like local businesses and organizations, also do a lot of cabling and other stuff. We also have an abortion doula collective in DC called DC Doulas for Choice. So we doula at 2 abortion clinics in DC. And are working on expanding more into medication abortion and self-managed abortion support. So dcdoulasforchoice.org. I think we usually accept applications around the spring, and then we train in the fall.
DC Doulas for Choice.
Doulas.
Does anyone else have an org that they wanna plug?
Can you repeat the word? I think I'm here.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So it's DC Doulas for Choice, the abortion doula org. For choice, yeah.
And then.
I volunteer as a clinic escort with the Washington Area Clinic Defense Task Force, WAC. It's a horrible acronym. But there's all over the DMV out towards like Falls Church. I volunteer at one in Rockville, I think DC too. So if you want to stand on a sidewalk and look at people with ugly posters and make sure people know how to get inside to access healthcare, it's fun sometimes, but most of the time, yeah.
And I also volunteer with the DC abortion funds. If you are someone who is interested in helping with case management, or so DC abortion fund helps folks who are either in the DMV or traveling to the region, pay for their abortion care. So if you are interested in being case manager, that in volunteer wise is the most helpful thing there. DCabortionfund.org is where you can get that information. Otherwise, as the name suggests, money is also very helpful if you're someone who has funds or is able to go on fundraisers or something like that as well. Separate to that, I also volunteer sometimes with this organization called the DC Area Practical Support Network. And they help those both with escorting, also like rides to clinics, or housing if they're like especially things like that as well. I will warn they are run by some like second wave feminist ladies, so just like do be aware. But nonetheless, you know, I especially for someone who like has a car, that's a great way to, you know, funds to help drive folks to their appointments or things like that as well. Practical support.
Thank you for that. Carol.
Yeah, so I'm not pushing an organization, but I do want to say that the information that you put forward about the Trump action to release to pardon abortion violent offenders is going to automatically increase violence at abortion clinics. And this is, you know, something that's of great concern, and of course will discourage people from even going. So to the extent that more people are willing to volunteer their time, it's really important. And I appreciate your raising this, as well as my comrades here, you know, talking about that.
No, thank you so much, Cameron, because I was really gonna be like, and next, can people please plug? I know that y'all put in your forms, the all amazing work that you're doing, and I mean, we intentionally like cultivated this space as a space to learn and like kind of give ourselves more context. But also like something I knew coming into it today was like there was gonna be a lot of like-minded individuals and folks. And it's like, it's not, I don't think it's lame to say this, but like just to be in this space right here, right now, to be talking about this, to be able to form those connections, like is like what we need to be doing right now. And so you may have been sitting in the group, like listening to our project, our slides and us present for 2 hours, but like, please like talk to someone, like make a connection. If it's okay with the folks who like plug their orgs, it's okay if people come up to you afterwards, like ask, wonderful, I assumed. But yeah, please get connected because to learn is a starting point to be able to take action and do the unsexy but very important work of organizing. No pussy hats right now, we're getting in it. We're doing shit, yeah.
I have a question. What is the Claudia Jones School? How can people learn more about it?
Funny that you asked. I just happen to have another PowerPoint open. Oh my God. That's us. I know, another 2 hours. No, we're Claudia Jones School, so we are popular education for the masses, right? So we do a lot of different programming. We have book clubs, we have Saturday schools like today, which is why you're here today. Thank you so much for showing up. Film screenings and a lot of different things in collaboration with other groups that are already doing the work, right? You don't need to reinvent the wheel. You really just need to get tapped in with the folks that are already doing the work and just support what they're doing. So we do have some other events that are coming up soon. This being one of them, that's part of the other slideshows. If you'd like to see all of the slideshow, you can come to this event. So this is our No Crime and Genocide film screening and discussion, which is happening next Sunday, February 9th at 2 p.m. at the Dorothy I. Height Library. It's got a really long name. It's like Dorothy I. Height / Benning Neighborhood Library. But if you put it in, you'll find us. And all of the funds and donations, everything, we'll also have merch for sale and stuff like that, is donated directly to a family of 40+ people still living in displaced Palestine. They were displaced, so some of them live in the West Bank, some of them are in different parts, but this is actually funds that can get to them. And even in light of what we see in our media news cycle, people are still displaced, people still need funds, they still need help, and they need it directly, and they need it now. So if you would like to donate, you can purchase a ticket. It's on the Eventbrite. You can also just go to our Instagram, Claudia Jones School, and you'll be able to like see all of our events. They're usually pinned at the top. But the most important part about this event specifically is that we will have someone from the Museum of Palestinian Peoples and Filmacine themselves, the collective, are all over. They do film screenings all over the world. And so they won't be here, but we'll be doing it on their behalf. They do have merchandise from Palestine, and they were able to get it shipped here. And so we have things for sale, again, which will also directly go to supporting his family. And you'll learn more about it at that event. So for now, that is it. The last thing I just want to say, if I go back to this one. Oh, is there another question?
Yeah,
Oh,
I
go
just
ahead.
want to present the Free DC organization. We're advocating for a DC statehood right now. And I don't exactly know when, but they're planning on going into federal buildings and purposely going into the wrong restrooms to kind of like protest this recent executive order. So it's not direct, but you know, DC autonomy is very closely related to, you know, reproductive autonomy.
Thank you. Yeah.
Carol.
I have a related, unrelated announcement if I could make. So we talked about here Project 2025 and the attack on reproductive justice and more is only one part of it. So the attack on workers, of course, is something that is happening now, particularly at the start with federal employees. And I would urge people to listen to